Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to find that the Middle East you knew yesterday no longer exists. This is not a metaphor. It's not a drill. Right now, while you're watching this, a countdown is running. When it hits 0 tonight, one of two things will happen. Either the world's most powerful military will launch a strike that could reshape the entire region in a matter of hours, or the world will once again watch the loudest ultimatum of the decade quietly fold. But here's what nobody is telling you. This time, Iran isn't negotiating. This time, civilians are forming human chains around power plants. This time, the UN is holding emergency meetings behind closed doors. And this time, the Gulf states that have remained silent for weeks are beginning to act. So, before you scroll past this article or assume it's just another headline, ask yourself one question. What would happen to the global economy, oil prices, and your daily life if the Strait of Hormuz became a war zone tonight? Stay with me. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to explain exactly what is happening, why it is more important than any other news story right now, and what the next 24 hours could mean for the whole world. Let's start at the source. President Donald Trump has issued his final demand to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Do it by 8 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Otherwise, Iran will face consequences unlike anything it has ever experienced, in his own words. Now, politicians issue threats all the time. That's nothing new. But it was the specific language Trump used that stopped the world in its tracks. He didn't say, "We will respond with force." He didn't say, "We are considering military options." He said, and these are his exact words, that every bridge in Iran would be destroyed by midnight. He said that every power plant would be burning and exploding and would never be used again. He suggested that the entire country could be taken out in one night, and that night might be tonight. 4 hours. That's the time frame he described for the total collapse of an entire nation's infrastructure. Now, is that militarily realistic? We'll get to that. But first, consider the gravity of what the sitting President of the United States has just said. This isn't a tweet. This isn't a campaign rally. These are explicit public threats to destroy civilian infrastructure, such as bridges and power plants, the systems that keep ordinary Iranian people alive. And that distinction matters, not just morally, but legally too. Under international law, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure is not a gray area. It is a war crime. Full stop. We'll come back to that legal dimension in a moment, because it has enormous implications for how America's allies and the UN are responding right now. But first, let's talk about the history of this deadline, because context is everything here. If you've been following this story, you'll have heard the word deadline a lot lately. First, there was the 48-hour deadline. Then, there was the 5-day deadline. Then, the 10-day deadline. There was a deadline that was supposed to expire last night, but then it quietly became a new deadline that expires tonight. Each time, the language became more urgent. Each time, the world held its breath. And each time, the clock ran out, and the next deadline appeared. So you can understand why, when Iran's military spokesperson appeared on camera today, he didn't seem nervous. In fact, he looked almost contemptuous. He called Trump's statements, and this is an exact translation, the rude rhetoric and arrogance of a delusional U.S. president. He said that these threats arise from what Iran sees as a deadlock, an American military campaign that has, in Tehran's view, suffered repeated defeats and humiliations in the region. He made it clear that no threat, ultimatum, or bombing campaign would stop Iran's offensive and crushing operations against American and Israeli forces. This is not the language of a government looking for a way out. It is the language of a government that has strategically and consciously decided that backing down is more dangerous than standing firm. Here is why this calculation makes a certain brutal sense. If Iran backs down this time, what will happen next time? What will happen when the next demand arrives, whether it's about nuclear capabilities, regional proxies, or something else entirely? The moment you establish that American threats produce Iranian compliance, You have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the region for a generation. The Iranian leadership understands this, and that's why, even though bridges and power plants are at risk, Tehran's public stance has remained consistent. We will not surrender. Now, I want you to pause on this moment in the story, because amid all the geopolitical maneuvering, the threats, counter-threats, UN votes, and diplomatic cables, something happened on the ground in Iran that speaks volumes about the mood in the country. Ordinary Iranian citizens began forming human chains around power plants. Not soldiers, not government officials, civilians, men and women standing shoulder to shoulder around the very infrastructure that their president had just threatened to destroy. Think about what that means. These are people who know better than most what American air power is capable of. They have watched what happened in Iraq. They have seen the footage from Gaza. They are under no illusions about what a serious U.S. military strike would entail. And yet, they showed up anyway. You can interpret that in different ways. Some will say it's government-organized theater, a propaganda exercise designed to project unity. Maybe, but even if that's partially true, the fact that it's happening at all, that this is the image Iran wants the world to see, reveals something important about the psychology of this conflict. Iran is not presenting itself as a country that is afraid. It is presenting itself as a country that is prepared. And in the theater of modern warfare, that distinction carries real strategic weight. While all this was unfolding in public, something else was happening behind the scenes. And that's the part of the story that should genuinely worry you. There was a deal on the table. International mediators working across multiple channels proposed a 45-day ceasefire. Not a permanent resolution, not a peace treaty, just a pause. It would give diplomacy breathing space, open back channels, and allow both sides to step back from the brink. For a brief moment, it looked like it might work. Trump initially called it a significant proposal. Significant? Coming from a president who had spent weeks issuing bombing threats, calling something significant was at least an acknowledgement that the diplomatic path existed. And then, hours later, he reversed it. Not good enough, he said. The deal was not good enough. Iran's rejection was more structured, but equally firm. Iranian state media reported that Tehran had reviewed the proposal against 10 specific criteria and rejected it. They didn't just say, "We reject this ceasefire." They said, "We will not agree to a temporary pause. We want a definitive, permanent end to this conflict." With that, they laid out their full list of demands. Firstly, an end to all regional conflicts, a formal protocol to guarantee safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, full reconstruction of everything that has been destroyed, and the complete lifting of all international sanctions. Are these demands realistic in the current situation? Almost certainly not. But they are revealing. What Iran is signaling is that they are not interested in a ceasefire that simply resets the clock to 27th February, the day before this war began. They want something fundamentally different to emerge from this crisis. Whether this is a negotiating position or a genuine red line is the question that diplomats from Doha to Geneva are trying to answer right now. Let's take a step back for a moment. I want to make sure we're all clear on exactly what is at stake, both economically and for every single person watching this video, not just for the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. Approximately 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply flows through that strait every day. Every day, under normal circumstances. However, since the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran on February 28th, Iran has imposed what analysts are now describing as an effective blockade of the strait. This is not a total physical closure, but rather a combination of military posturing and threatened strikes on tankers. The practical reality is that no shipping company wants to send a vessel through a potential war zone without extraordinary insurance premiums and security guarantees. The result has been a seismic shock to global energy markets. Oil prices have surged. Gas prices in countries ranging from the United States to Germany to Japan have spiked sharply. Governments around the world have been forced to tap into strategic reserves, implement emergency energy measures, and begin difficult conversations about supply chain alternatives which do not yet exist on the necessary scale. And here is the compounding problem. There is no quick fix. Even if the Strait of Hormuz reopened tomorrow and every Iranian naval vessel stood down, the market disruption, rerouting of tankers, and insurance recalculations would still take weeks to normalize, possibly months. What if this continues for another month, or another 3 months? The economic modeling on prolonged disruption to the Strait of Hormuz is genuinely alarming. And it doesn't just affect nations that import oil. It affects food prices, manufacturing costs, and transportation, impacting the entire interconnected web of the global economy. This is not just a regional conflict with regional consequences. It is a crisis with a global price tag. And it's getting more expensive with every passing day. So, what role is the international community playing in all of this? Today, the UN Security Council is voting on a resolution addressing the Hormuz crisis. The story of how that resolution came to be, and what has been removed from it, reveals the limitations of international institutions under pressure. 2 weeks ago, Bahrain, supported by a coalition of Gulf oil exporting states, proposed a robust draft resolution. It would have provided an explicit UN mandate authorizing member states to use force, if necessary, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. However, that draft was rejected. Several permanent members of the Security Council, including France, indicated that they would veto any resolution expressly authorizing military force. And so the draft was rewritten, and rewritten again. What emerged from this process, according to most diplomatic assessments, is a significantly watered-down document. One that addresses the crisis in carefully neutral language, but which does not authorize anyone to take action with force. You might ask why this matters if the U.S. military is already operating in the region. Why is a UN mandate needed? The answer lies in legitimacy. Coalition building. It is the difference between unilateral American military action and a genuinely multinational response. It is the difference between what the U.S. can ask its allies to do and what those allies can justify to their own parliaments and public. Without a robust UN mandate, any Gulf state considering joining a coalition force would do so without international legal cover. And in such a volatile region, where populations are so attentive to questions of sovereignty and international law, that cover matters a lot. A lot. This brings us to what is arguably the most complex aspect of the crisis, the position of the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait. These are countries that are currently absorbing Iranian missile and drone strikes on a near-daily basis. They have every reason to want to see Iran's military capacity degraded. They have capable air forces. They have modern naval assets. They also have deep historical security relationships with the United States. And yet, with one partial exception, none of them have directly entered this conflict. The UAE recently broke from this pattern slightly by signaling a willingness to participate in a coalition force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. However, even this signal was conditional and short of a firm commitment. Why? Because these governments are engaged in a brutal strategic calculation. Every option on the table has serious costs. Consider the core dilemma. If they join the coalition, they are committing their militaries and territories to a conflict whose outcome is uncertain. Critically, they would be doing so in partnership with a U.S. administration that, in living memory, has abruptly pivoted away from regional commitments when domestic political winds have shifted. If America were to walk away tomorrow, as it has done in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, the Gulf states would be left face-to-face with an angry and wounded Iran right on their doorstep. No American aircraft carrier could protect Riyadh or Dubai from the consequences. However, there is a second layer to this calculation, which diplomats such as former Indian Ambassador Navdeep Suri are now openly discussing. Would a weakened Iran actually be in the Gulf states' long-term interest? The alternative to a weakened Iran in the current regional landscape is an Israel that faces no meaningful counterbalance, an Israel that, with full American backing, has been carrying out strikes across multiple countries in the region, as Suri described, with unlimited impunity. If unchecked, Israel's regional ambitions may eventually extend to areas that would make even its current Gulf allies uncomfortable. Over a 10-year horizon, which threat is more manageable? A damaged but defiant Iran or an emboldened Israel operating without restraint? There is currently no consensus on the answer to this question in the region. This lack of consensus is a significant reason why no unified Gulf response has materialized. Before we reach the final analysis, I would like to draw your attention to one more aspect of this story that, in my opinion, is not receiving sufficient coverage in the mainstream media: the legal dimension. When Trump threatened to destroy all of Iran's bridges and power plants, he wasn't just making a military threat. According to the Geneva Conventions, customary international humanitarian law, and the Rome Statute that governs the International Criminal Court, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure is a war crime. It's not a gray area. It's not a matter of interpretation. It is a war crime. Bridges and power plants are civilian infrastructure. They serve civilian populations. Deliberately destroying them in a way that deprives civilian populations of essential services crosses a clear legal line that the international community has spent decades establishing. As Ambassador Suri said, these threats are completely illegal, and yet they were made, publicly, by the President of the United States. So far, there has been no meaningful formal condemnation from America's closest allies. What does that silence signal? What does it mean for the rules-based international order, a framework that the United States itself built and championed for 80 years, when the country that created it seems ready to abandon it? These are not abstract questions. They are questions that leaders in Berlin, Paris, Tokyo, and New Delhi are grappling with tonight. How they answer, or fail to answer, them will shape the architecture of international law and norms for decades to come. So, here we are. The deadline expires tonight. Iran has rejected the ceasefire. Trump says the deal isn't good enough. The UN vote is happening now. The Gulf states are watching and calculating. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranian civilians are standing with their hands linked around power plants, waiting. We have been here before, with different deadlines and the same escalating rhetoric, and every previous deadline has passed without the promised strike. But here is what I will leave you with. Even if tonight passes quietly, even if there is another extension or deadline or round of back-channel diplomacy, the underlying crisis will not have gone away. The Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed. The global economy is still absorbing the shockwaves. The legal and moral frameworks that govern warfare are still under unprecedented pressure. The Gulf region is still teetering on the brink of an armed confrontation or a diplomatic resolution that neither side currently believes in. The story is not over. In fact, it has barely begun. Whatever happens in the next 24 hours, stay informed. Ask hard questions. Think carefully about who would benefit from a world in which ultimatums replace diplomacy and threats replace law. We'll be here, covering every development as it happens.